I'm gonna do the water first.
Yeah, you got to get into that podcaster voice, right? It's a different voice than you use from a day-to-day basis.
It really is, and that is a sad thing. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from. I'm Weirzy from Fallout Daily Discussion, and welcome to a Fallout debate, or perhaps as I like to call it, a Fallout about Fallout. I'm joined by Jessica Starr from the Fallout feed, United Wastelanders, her amazing camp builds, and lots of other Fallout content. And I'm also joined by Rob Cunningham, who's an educator, an entertainer, a fully credentialed teacher with mathematics, and a voice actor with the Modus Files and Once Upon a Wasteland. So welcome, guys. Today, we're going to be debating one idea that I believe the community hasn't actually reached a consensus on yet. And that idea is that the railroad is a force for good in the Commonwealth. So Jessica is going to be representing our agreeing opinion with that statement, and Rob will be taking the disagree stance. So I'm going to hand over to them now to make their arguments, and we'll get to hear what they have to say.
Okay, so let's get started then. The question, the resolved as it were, is the railroad a force for good in the Commonwealth? So obviously we need some common ground to start with on that to really discuss the points. Let's see, an important word in there is good. So let's define force for good in society. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines good as of a favorable character or tendency, possessing or displaying moral virtue. That's it as an adjective. Also as a noun, to the benefit or advantage to someone or something. Okay, so you have both an adjective version there and a noun version. I want to address both. I also think it's important to say that there is a matter of scope. One thing that we all talk about in the Fallout community is that many of the factions are gray, and that's partly what makes them interesting. Okay, a force for good doesn't mean all good. Some gray is deliberately written into the wasteland. It's about balance. Do they create more good than not? Is there a net balance towards the positive? And so I'm going to argue on behalf of the railroad that yes, they both have a favorable character tendency, possess and display moral virtue, and are to the benefit or advantage of the Commonwealth, ultimately in the net. So who are the railroad? They are a group of freedom fighters and abolitionists, kind of a ragtag group compared to some of the other factions. Well, the Minutemen start small at the point you find them. All of these groups have a history, to be honest, and we're talking about the railroad today. So they have been through a lot. They've been around for a while, but they're kind of a ragtag band. They have named leaders that we can all kind of remember. They're like the crew of the Firefly. They are a misfit squad of heroes. Main characters faction have names, abilities, what they do matter, and the impact they have as a small group is greater than their numbers would imply. For many other factions, you're just, you're a cog in the machine. But the railroad, they are together for an ideal, and they are actually rather effective. Don't get me wrong, they make mistakes, but ultimately they work towards their goals. So let me give you a quote from Beacon to kind of also describe who the railroad is and how they work. At one point, when you get into Deacon and know him a little bit, and you're kind of asking, well, there are so many things we can do. Why are we focused on synths and fighting the Institute? Deacon says, we're not about saving the world. It's too big a job for too few, but we're trying to make it better, one synthetic at a time. We care about the little guys, maybe lend a hand on the side, not as much as some would like, but hey, it's something. So they have their focus, okay? Their focus is obviously on fighting the Institute and saving synths. I would say these things go hand in hand because in order to rescue synths, if you want to put it that way, or bring freedom to the synthetic beings that they rescue, they have to thwart the Institute's plans. They have to track, countermand, and there is a major benefit to not just the synths in so doing, but also the Institute's goals in the wasteland and people who would be affected by the Institute's actions. To give it a briefer summary, the way Desdemona puts it is, when it comes to synths, we're the only ones who give a damn. They believe synths are equal to humans in pretty much all respects. Built different, but equal. Current state of the Commonwealth, okay? The Commonwealth that they are bringing good to, as in they are a force for good in the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth struggles with regular wasteland things, food, raiders, radiation, ferals, It's all there. But there are other factors unique to the Commonwealth. There is a fear, hopelessness, and distrust created by the Institute. They are there, and people, they're suspicious of their neighbors. They're suspicious of their friends. They are suspicious of their brothers. In the case of when you first arrive at Diamond City and you see, one brother attacking another because he thinks he's a synth and actually killing him on the street. So there's this layer of fear and suspicion that is unique to the Commonwealth because of what the Institute represents and what the actions they've had so far. Also, unique to the Commonwealth, the plight of the synths themselves, okay? Many people feel that at least the goals of the railroad are noble, trying to help the synths. When people talk about the Institute, you can come across any number of conversations in the wasteland where residents of Diamond City, various settlers will talk to each other and, they'll talk about the Institute and like, well, is anyone fighting against them? And they're like, well, the railroad, they're like, oh, the railroad isn't real. Do they exist? Okay, so they are kind of the mythical saviors or helpers, which is why before the show, we talked about how for some people, when they at least first encounter the railroad, they think of them as a default good position. And I understand they are gray, and maybe they are not default good, but once again, I'm arguing for the net good. So working against the Institute does help people of the Commonwealth by default, removing opportunities for replacement, removing opportunities for fear, for minimizing the impact of the Institute on the Commonwealth. Let's see, not worth saving. Okay, some people feel that the synths themselves, they would argue that maybe the synths are less than human, or they are not worth saving. Because there are bigger problems facing the Commonwealth. If you have an organization or an infrastructure like the railroad has that is able to be effective, get stuff done, why don't you fight some of the direct problems that the Commonwealth face? Like I said, food, raiders, those kind of struggles. Hey, help build homes. There's good in that. And there is, but it's not bad to have a focus. The railroad doesn't ignore these entirely, but these are problems that can be worked on and dealt with by people who have the freedom to do so. The railroad fights for those who do not have the freedom to do so now. Okay, so they are really bringing synths to a more level playing field, ultimately. I think it's a compelling enough reason that the railroad has returned and grown over the years and keeps attracting new people. Railroad, let's see, they have been around. They're an ongoing group. They started after the Broken Mask Institute in Diamond City, not long after, but once people began to realize what synths were. We don't know much about their history prior to, I think it's like around 2266 or so, when they were first broken up by the Institute. Up to that point, they hadn't been rescuing synths as much as advocating for synth freedom and working against the Institute a little bit. Then they came back, they were rebuilt. Let's see, they had Wyatt took over and they became more covert. They started to work undercover and they started to help rescue synths. They were hit again in 2273, but escaped, Wyatt and John D. After a while, it was run by someone named Pinky for a bit. Then Desdemona took over. Desdemona's been running the railroad, as it were, for probably, I don't know, a good 6 years, I think, at least 5. Brought them and helped them kind of restore prominence, actually lay down the infrastructure they have, find the switchboard, one of their areas of operation, and recover the PAM unit, which is another tool in their arsenal that kind of helps them work against the Institute. I would say that while her methods are strong, that her strong stance has what has allowed the the railroad to flourish against the Institute, because they make no mistake. They are the underdogs. They are the small ragtag team, as I described them. They are working for the good of their beliefs, their idealism, and against an enemy much tougher than they are. So they have to take some strong measures. I'll start to wrap up now. I'm going to say that, I'll appeal to emotion to encourage logic here. I am arguing on the pro side, but not just because that's the side I was given, but because I do have strong feelings for the Institute. I'm not going to tell you all the criticisms are invalid, but I would suggest that the negative impact of them can be overstated. You go on YouTube and you will see many videos about why the Institute, why the railroad is evil, why they are the worst faction. This has become a strong argument in the community. And I will just say that while some of those arguments have validity, that sometimes the impact of them is overstated. And as a bit of a railroad stan, I hope you give a chance to listen to what I have to say. Few actively stand against the Institute. Even fewer stand up for the synths. Their mission and Pam make them uniquely suited to do so. And if not the railroad standing for the synths, fighting the Institute, then who?
I think that's a fantastic time for me to go ahead and start making my argument. I'm going to say that my argument today hinges on two key ideas. First, that the railroad actually lacks the competence to be a force for good in the Commonwealth, and that their primary method for hiding synths is actually morally indefensible. However, before I start, I do want to make a couple of key concessions right out the gate. Number one, synths are people, as far as I'm concerned. I'm not in that debate. They deserve freedom, and the fact that the railroad recognizes this puts them above both the Institute and the Brotherhood in terms of morality. Second, and this is important, I believe that the railroad is genuinely doing what they feel to be right. Their intentions are, as you said, noble. However, as we've seen both in Fallout games and in real life, good intentions don't automatically make you a force for good. Good intentions need to be backed up with competent moral action, and this is where I feel like the railroad falls just a little bit short. Let me take you back to the point in the game where the sole survivor locates the railroad for the very first time. You start by following the very famous Freedom Trail, which is a very obvious path, which leads you to a very obvious cave with a very, very obvious quote unquote secret entrance whose password is literally railroad. It is only by sheer unbridled luck that the sole survivor found the place before the Institute did again. Now, this might just be an in-game conceit to make the player feel smart for being able to find the railroad's headquarters, but this isn't the first or the last time this has happened. If you read through the logs in the railroad hideout, you find at least 2 more times when their lair has been discovered and destroyed. It happens again during the events of Fallout 4. And I feel that if an organization is going to task itself with preserving and saving innocent lives and sending them to safety, they need to be able to take care of their own safety first. And I feel like the railroad just can't do that. Speaking of sending them to safety, is that what they're doing, really? Until the sole survivor goes to Far Harbor, the railroad has no idea where their charges are going once they've left the Commonwealth. They have no idea if there's an Institute checkpoint 3 miles down the road that is taking every single escaped synth back and reprocessing them in their facilities. To combat this uncertainty and to make the synths a little bit more difficult to find, the railroad engages in an act that I feel is absolutely morally reprehensible. When a synth has made their way to the surface, the railroad tries to convince them that the best course of action is to have all of their memories wiped and their personality wiped clean like a hard drive, and then reinstall a new personality that they literally just made up. They then send this new person, who is now unaware that they are still being hunted by the Institute, off to make their own way outside of the Commonwealth. Now, not only is this procedure incredibly dangerous, as we find out during the Curie storyline, but even if it is successful, the person that they send out of the Commonwealth is not the same person that sought freedom in the first place. That person is dead, wiped out by the railroad, and replaced with someone else who looks identical. Does that sound a little bit familiar to anybody? Their argument is that the synths volunteer for this. They choose to be mind wiped. After all, if they are free to decline the service, as it were, then the procedure is voluntary, so there's no problem. But I'm going to push back against that as well. I want you to imagine for a moment that you have spent your entire existence doing nothing but exactly what you're told. You've never had so much as a single conversation with anyone because in the Institute, carrying on a conversation is considered deviant behavior and makes you subject to, you guessed it, a mind wipe. So these people have never spoken to so much as another human before meeting the railroad, except maybe Patriot. They know nothing of life on the surface. They don't know anything about the Commonwealth. They don't know about the challenges of living there. Their entire existence has consisted of sterile hallways and forced menial labor. So when Desdemona, who is a very charismatic leader, tells them that the memory wipe is the most safe way to go, that it is the preferable way to go, of course they're going to say yes. They are programmed to say yes. Instead of trying to figure out how to free the synths as they are, the railroad takes the easy way out by effectively convincing them to commit suicide. Now, it's true, these synths are full of trauma and horror from their time in the Institute. We learn from H222's goodbye message that he has nightmares of being hunted and that they affect his quality of life. But he also tells us, quote, "Everyone says I'll be safer if I start a new life." That right there is the thrust of my argument. Instead of helping these poor people work through their trauma, the railroad offers a fast solution: just die, so that someone else can live on, hopefully safer, in your body. And this has had some good results. Look at Sturgis, look at Magnolia. These are rescued synths who have gone on to do amazing things after the mind wipe. However, I'm pretty sure there's at least one other synth that escaped, had his mind wiped, and decided to become a raider boss. So I don't think we can really take into account the pluses or minuses of what they become, because we don't necessarily know what they would have become if they were able to just work through their trauma. As a final thought, I'd like to mention that I do support the idea that everyone has the right to die if they choose, human or synth. If someone decides that life is too unbearable to continue living for any reason, they should have the option to end it. However, the railroad sees this as a first resort rather than a last resort, and they pressure synths into accepting it before they could possibly give free, informed consent. They aren't rescuing people, they are just moving bodies around. They're treating memories, personalities, and consciousness as a secondary concern, which proves to me that at some subconscious level, they are still looking at synths as objects, as vessels that can be emptied, refilled, and sent on their way. I believe that synths are people, and that's exactly why I feel the railroad is not a force for good in the Commonwealth. I do not believe that they are a net good. I don't believe that the good that they do create outweighs the evil that both their methods and their general incompetence creates. I believe that they put everybody at risk, and I believe that they could use a little bit of update in their methods. And that's what I've got. Thank you very much.
Okay. Wow. Thank you both very, very much for sharing. I tell you what I think is really interesting right off the bat. Both of you, without talking about this beforehand, have went down a route where you're discussing the net effect, right? Like, and again, still having, you know, different stances, but both talking about how with the morally gray parts, with the parts that you do or disagree with, there is or isn't a net good. So I actually like how we've got even more specific than just are they good, but is it a net good effect? Okay, so look, I just have a few questions that I had thought of in advance, and some that I had thought of while you guys were speaking, and I just wanted to kind of bring them to each of you, and then in a moment or two, we'll just all get in and we can just all chat about it together. So, Jessica, I'm going to start with you. You mentioned a couple of times through your argument about Pam and how Pam is quite important for the railroad, and how she kind of gives them a upper edge that, you know, essentially allows them to function. Here's a thought that I had right about Pam in terms of a net good. Pam was able to predict the Great War 2 hours before it happens, and we know from the game that she's quite easily reprogrammable. Tinker Tom manages it, and some of the scribes in the Brotherhood can manage it as an optional, you know, as an optional part of the game. Would Pam be better protecting settlements than protecting headquarters? You know, would Pam be better put to use for the Commonwealth, for the Wasteland, if she was with the Minutemen, if she was with I'm forgetting the name now, unfortunately, but
Preston.
Yes, Preston. Thank you very much. And if she was with, you know, the settlers of the Commonwealth, if she could predict, you know, you get these little beep beep beeps on your Pip-Boy about super mutant attacks and whatnot.
Indeed.
would the wasteland be better if Palm was actually an open source sort of predictor rather than just held by the railroad?
Well, that's interesting. I actually think that's a really interesting question. To be frank, probably yes.
Yep.
That there is a lot of use, but working with the railroad as she is does not prohibit her doing more. Okay,
Mhm.
so we're
Mhm.
dealing with the Commonwealth as it is at the time, and I think that's really important. Right now, she is a tool working with the railroad to help work against the Institute being the big looming threat.
Yep.
And in doing that, it is helping everyone. As I tried to argue earlier, I do feel that thwarting the railroad is a net good for everyone. Ultimately, the sole survivor can be both a member of the railroad and General the Minutemen. We're not precluding one or the other.
Yep.
And
Yep.
how will Pam work after the Institute is taken down? What will the railroad become? I mean, that is a whole nother thing. Now, that's for the future.
Mhm.
Okay,
Mhm.
we can't necessarily speculate. Well, they are good because of what they will do, not what they have done. Although you get that argument all the time from Institute people, like, well, when I'm in charge of the Institute and Father's not there anymore, they can do this. Okay, I'm just going to quickly bring around to the they good bad things argument there. People often root for other factions, saying the sole survivor could influence them or turn them around, turning factions that aren't a force for good into something better. In the case of a railroad, we have an institution that is already dedicated to a good and noble cause with some flaws. Okay, so can they be turned around? Probably. Are they already in a better location or position than most other factions? Definitely. So I would say the same can be said about their flaws as well, including their use of resources such as Pam.
I think that's a great. I think that's a great reply because within that, as you say, super mutants attacking your fifth settlement is one matter, but as you say, the looming threat of the Institute and what's going to happen over time there is potentially more urgent and more substantial.
Settlers could learn a bit from the railroad about protecting themselves and not getting themselves kidnapped every couple hours. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And so look, just one other just quick question. You also talked a little bit about Desdemona,
Mhm.
about her leadership style, about how she is quite effective in getting things done, and I totally agree with you. Um, Something that I hadn't actually picked up from the games, something that the wiki taught me, right, is that the railroad essentially runs off of a pyramid-shaped power structure. So you have on the very base of that pyramid what they call tourists, which is just all the folks out there who are willing to help and chip in and follow the dead drops and essentially just contribute generally. And then you go above that, and you have the folks in the not in the headquarters, but in the different little bases they have distributed. And then the next tier, you have the field operatives like Deacon, and then above that again, you have the actual headquarters staff. So that's Tinker Tom, the Doctor, Glory, and so on. And then on the very, very top, on their own, you have the leader. And essentially, although Desdemona is benevolent, you essentially have a somewhat of a dictatorship where you have one person who ultimately calls the shots. Now, I understand that in the situation the railroad's in, that's important for how they function. To have someone who's there to make a quick decision, I get the value of that. But as you mentioned, there's discussion about their past, and there's that guy Pinky, and a lot of people apparently, again, I'm going off lore stuff on the wiki. Apparently, he kind of wasn't as benevolent and maybe a bit lazy at times, dropped the ball on a few things, and that's how the switchboard kind of stuff happens, where their HQ gets totally raided. And I guess what I wanted to ask was, as far as being a net good in the wasteland, is that kind of power structure, you know, when we look around our world and see those kind of power structures and how vulnerable they can be, especially as you say, in terms of post events of the game, what do we, you know,
The railroad
the railroad just
isn't
disband?
a faction that is intended to persist. The railroad is not a permanent fixture in the wasteland. They are created out of a necessity and a reaction. to the actions of the Institute and to the plight of the synths. Okay, so they are not intended to be a long-term going forward solution. That's kind of like, say, Dragon Age Inquisition. The Inquisition comes up, they're meant to do a purpose, and the Inquisition is disbanded. Same thing with the Railroad. That power structure and that singular focus, possibly dictatorial, is necessary for the effectiveness. Okay, we need to look at, once again, the situation right now. I talked about it a little bit, but there's a McCarthyism of sorts happening right now in the wasteland against synths. Okay, the idea that your friend, neighbor, spouse could be a synth has everyone riled. A single slip could mean death. Therefore, being so covert, so hidden, having that type of power structure has been necessary to maintain secrecy. Now, whether or not they're the best at it, as Rob mentioned, with being able to follow the trails like that, a lot of that is a game conceit, no doubt. So the player character can find it. And supposedly Desdemona is the best at this so far. The game goes out of its way to tell you that previously they made slips, but now they're in a much better place. Mm-hmm. And you get that through the dead drops and getting to play spy and being part of this cool ass team. And, there's a lot of vibes there. But yeah, she is a strong power with a singular goal, saving synths above all else. Other people in the Railroad, while they work for her, they do have some of their own stuff and may help a little more along the way. But yeah, she has one goal, it's true.
Yeah, but I do think you're right to point out that, we can only really ever focus on and know the events of the game, right? The before and the after is very much so up in the air. And you're right that Desdemona is consistently in game making the good calls.
When the game ends, has the Commonwealth improved if you follow the Railroad path? Is there a net good? We've got the moral question, which Rob definitely addressed a good bit as well. But then there's also the, good for the Commonwealth question, as in a benefit or advantage of someone or something, i.e. have they benefited the Commonwealth?
If we were going to look ahead into the future, which I agree we probably shouldn't do, because, there are lots of different ways that the Soul Survivor could go. But there is the question of whether or not Desdemona would be willing to relinquish that power after the Institute is destroyed.
Right.
Because in history, folks who have that kind of power tend to begin jumping at shadows afterwards, right? The main Institute is destroyed. There was this big explosion. The whole Commonwealth can see it. But I feel like Desdemona, and probably Tinker Tom as well, are going to spend the rest of their lives seeing the Institute behind every corner. So the question is whether or not the Institute is destroyed, will Desdemona actually feel like, okay, it's safe to let go of this power and have a more democratic, although admittedly sometimes more unstable faction like the Minutemen take over from there, that doesn't have that pyramid-shaped dictatorial, what's it? Oh, wow, I totally lost the thread of the word.
No, but
power structure, that's the word I'm looking for. Yeah. Jesus, Cunningham, what are you doing?
No, do you know, Rob, though, I think that's a good point, because again, I'll just disclaimer it again. We don't know what happens after the game, but
we do know that she's paranoid.
Yeah, and
like that's a thing that is well established, that she is extremely paranoid, and I feel like giving up that power would be against her character
for good reason.
Yeah, well, this is the thing, right? She's paranoid. Not wrong. Her paranoia is very beneficial during the events of the game, and I think what's interesting when you mentioned, they'll be seeing the Institute in every corner of their eye forever, and every shadow behind every door. I think as well with Desdemona's character, and as you even say, someone like Tinker Tom, that might not be malevolence. That might just be, it's been their life, right? So that, you don't just click your fingers and stop feeling that way. And yeah, that's an interesting angle that I hadn't thought of.
There's a lot of trauma all around, all around. There's a lot of trauma happening.
Well, look, Rob, I want to give you two little questions just about your argument, and then we'll just free flow with whatever we want to chat about. Thanks again, Jessica, for taking the time there. So look, Rob, I think you mentioned him in your argument. There's a synth who we meet in the game, H2-22, right? And it's probably the most explicit experience we get of how a synth moves through the motions of the railroad and experiences their memory wipe and so on. I mean, I think your points are really good about how you know, there's that line that you quoted where he kind of says, everyone's telling me this is the best thing to do. But then there's a couple of other lines in there, right? So he talks about, as you kind of mentioned, the trauma, the horrific nightmares. He talks about how in the little audio tape that he leaves you, how he's just not really sure if he can cope with the weight of the knowledge that the Institute are hunting him. He kind of, you know, it's not explicit, but he definitely does express some pretty despairing thoughts about the weight of knowing that going forward.
Wouldn't anyone?
Right? Of course, of course. But you know, and he even makes a little comment there that's very kind of emotionally on the button about, you know, the things that he's worried about is forgetting old man Stockham that helps him, and the railroad, and you, right? But then he still goes through with it. And I guess what I wanted to ask was, when you are talking about these synths kind of having that choice taken away from them loosely, and in terms of them not being equipped to make the decision, are you kind of babying them? Like, you know, if H222 weighs that up and sounds pretty sad to consider that he might forget the player or others, but then makes the call and goes for it, you know, is that not suggesting that he's actually had that ability to weigh it up and to decide?
In the case of H222 specifically, he seems to give that impression, right? That he is giving his own informed consent. And if that's the case, then I have no problem with his decision. Like I said at the end of my argument, I have no problem with someone deciding to end their own life if they decide that it's unbearable. But I want to make it very clear that that's what's happening here. This is not just oh, it's a cosmetic operation. In fact, it's not cosmetic at all. And that's kind of a problem, but we'll talk about that in a second. He is choosing to end his existence. He is choosing to essentially be euthanized and have some made up person go on in his stead. And he does have the ability to make that decision. As a free thinking being, he can make that decision. It's just very important that he make that decision fully aware of all of the consequences. In his personal case, it looks like he did. It looks like he saw what the wasteland was like. He saw what people were like to each other, and he made that decision himself. That said, in real life, there are lots of people who have been in horrible, awful situations that have nightmares for the rest of their lives. Some of them choose to end their own life, some of them don't, but it's very unusual to have someone telling them, your choice right now, your best, safest option is suicide. And I don't even necessarily think it's the best, safest option, because it's not like the Institute doesn't know what their synths look like. It's not like the Institute doesn't have a complete file with the pictures of every single synth that they've ever lost. So now H2-22 is wandering around the wasteland or wherever it is that he ends up with no knowledge that he is being hunted by a very powerful, at least until, you know, we blow it up, and very resourceful institution that knows what he looks like. So I feel like in that case, it's even less good for him specifically, because he now no longer knows that he has to hide. He no longer knows who's looking for him and why he should be scared. So yes, I respect his ability to make that choice, but I don't think that the events leading up to him making that choice were balanced. I think that the events leading up to H222 making the choice to undergo the procedure were mostly one-sided in the favor of the railroad and everyone else telling him that this was the safest course. And I don't necessarily agree.
I think that's a really valuable point, though, in terms of, you know, post memory wipe. Is he more vulnerable? You know, and that is hard to make a call on, but it's a real possibility.
And again, the Minutemen would not be able to get into the Institute if it wasn't for the synth or the railroad, right? The railroad wiped Sturge's memory. He's the one that builds, if you side with the Minutemen, he's the one that builds the teleporter that gets you into the Institute. So we can't say that there isn't good being done by the railroad,
right?
But what I can say is that there's no certainty that someone else wouldn't have invented that, as though you were to side with a different faction. And we don't know what kind of person Sturgis would have been if he had been allowed to keep his original memories. Maybe he would have been the same kind of person, but with a little bit more knowledge. Right. Or maybe not. We don't know.
Right. Or maybe he would never have thrived because he may have never got past that trauma. Right. Again, we just don't know. So yeah, just another question that I had, that actually I kind of pulled from Jessica's argument, actually, because I thought it was a really nice point just about the overall good. The point was made about them kind of being these kind of mythical heroes to a degree, where everybody kind of whispers about them, everybody knows a little bit. There's the freedom trail, but I agree with you, it's a little bit easy in game once you figure it out, but at least the NPCs are stumped. But
where are these pylons going?
Yeah, the pylons.
They're sitting right next to the obvious code thing. Where are these pylons going? They are going directly into the wall.
Yeah,
pre-war technology is frightening and confusing. There are so many wires strewn about, you just never know.
So Rob, I guess my question there is, do you think, look, for a brief moment, set aside the explicit synth work they do.
Okay.
I think as Fallout fans like to do, we like to flesh out our universe. We like to kind of think about the things that are implicit but not explicit in the games. There's got to be children out there, in the Commonwealth that like to pretend that, one plays, oh, I'm in the railroad, right? Is their presence positive even in that aspect? Is there a degree of hope, or is that just not really valuable?
It's valuable, but I don't think that the railroad has a monopoly on that. I think that once the sole survivor gets going, and again, it depends on whether we're talking about the beginning or the middle of the game, right? Because at the beginning of the game, the Minutemen are one person and a lost family or two, right? So without making this a Minutemen conversation, I would say that they could fill in that slot as well. Once they get going, once they have settlements at their call, once you have the flare gun, you can shoot it anywhere in the map, and within a minute, there are NPCs there to help you. So I feel like the Minutemen could be not only the whispered protectors of the Commonwealth, but they could be the very visible protectors of the Commonwealth.
Yep.
I don't think under those circumstances, having an anti-boogeyman is necessarily a necessity.
Okay. You know what?
That said, it is good. It is good to see that there are people who are taking an active stand against the Institute. Mm-hmm. That is a necessary thing. And I feel like, again, going off of canon, as the general of the Minutemen, I would definitely be pushing Preston Garvey and the rest to stop seeing synths as anything other than the oppressed people that they are.
Yep. And you know what? I think as we kind of move now towards just free flow and chat between us, I think that's a really good point to make. What I think is so kind of powerful, I guess, about this particular discussion is that even though we disagree or we debate the goodness of the railroad, all sides here agree that since whether or not they are people, they deserve to be treated as though they are people. I think we can say, and I think that's that's a really good bit of common ground in this. Whether or not the memory wipe is the best move, whether or not the Desdemona will relinquish her power, blah 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 blah. At the end of the day, something needs to be done.
It would have been easy to argue that synths are toasters and then make Jessica argue back against that. But I don't feel that's an important line of conversation. I feel like we should start with the idea that synths are sapient people and that they deserve freedom, and then we should go from there.
Yeah.
I'm not on the railroad is a bunch of thieves stealing property from the Institute bandwagon. That's not me.
Yeah.
I appreciate your arguments are very cogent. And I appreciate you starting there too. There are usually three main arguments against the railroad. The first is limited scope of operations, which I try to address and I do feel is misplaced. The second is the mind wipe procedure, which I will have to agree with you is morally reprehensible. Is it justified and necessary? We can talk about that a little bit more. But yeah, no, it's not a good thing. It is something that, were I in charge of the railroad, would be the first to change. And I imagine most of the railroad would after the Institute is gone. And then the final thing being, can synths be trusted? Are they people? Are they going to go berserk? And I would say to that, I'm glad we started from a standpoint of agreeing that they have thoughts, actions, they act as people and, can be. And we haven't had instances of synths going berserk that we know of since the broken mask incident, really.
And I really love the fact that there are examples of wiped synths going on to do great things like Sturgis and Magnolia. There's also a guy whose name I don't remember.
Yeah, the raider from Libertalia who starts out as a mercenary and then,
And so I like that idea. We can't really do the synths turn out to be good or bad people as a concern at all, because some of them are good and some of them are bad, just like anybody else.
Exactly.
And I really
I was about to say, I think that almost as much as anything else drives home their humanity, because you look at the amount of humans we see in the wasteland, some turn out to be Preston, some turn out to be Father, right? So that's a real mixed bunch. And and arguably Father's had a very protective life, in the Institute, but that's a whole other topic.
Fun fact, the very first time I played Fallout 4 and I found out that Father was Sean. Spoiler alert, I guess, if you're not, I don't know why you're watching or listening to this. Yeah, if you don't know the end of the game, I don't know why you're listening to this. But the moment I found that out the first time, my character, who was a melee character in Power Armor, went on a rampage, killed Father, killed everyone in the Institute, and died to Corsairs trying to escape. Like,
that's a choice.
That was the end of that playthrough to me. I did not make it to the end of the game. I re-rolled a different character because I was so surprised by that that like I felt like, oh no, this all has to be burned down right now. So I very much sympathize with the railroad's motives.
Did that character feel responsibility just as the parent of Sean in that case? Like, is that part of the reaction?
No, but well, yes and no. Not responsibility for getting him there, because he was stolen while she was at the time, that was a female character. She was in cryostasis, right? But it was a almost like the thing that your parents used to say to you when you messed up, like, I put you in this world and I can take you out of it. I felt like that was the responsibility, but that's an entirely different conversation.
Right.
No, well, no, it's okay. I'm enjoying that too. I can trim that down.
That was one guy's playthrough. You don't have to trim it out, but that was just my experience with my playthrough. I feel like the part where Desdemona asks the sole survivor to side with the railroad over the Minutemen was kind of the moment for me where I do feel like what the railroad would be best at is as an arm of the Minutemen. I feel like if the Minutemen had Desdemona and Tinker Tom and the rest as their sort of covert branch, but still answerable to the general and those running the Minutemen, that would be a better way to go. But that takes place after the events of the game.
No, but I think it's a good point. I mean, Jessica mentioned the same. Post Fallout 4, does the railroad need to exist? And I think that's a good question. I think
Desdemona will say yes. I agree. That's my problem. I feel like no matter how many Institute locations get blown up and how many Institute scientists get killed, that's the other thing, is you let most of the civilians go. I mean, assuming that you're playing even a remotely Paragon kind of playthrough, you at least let the civilians go, which means Desdemona is always going to be like, yeah, but the Institute's still out there. I still need this power.
Go ahead, Jessica.
I mean, that is a possibility. I would say that the game does give us some evidence about the future of the railroad after that in the whole To the Mattresses quest line. Okay, so after the Institute has been vanquished, continuing play of the sole survivor in the game while doing other things, you have a quest line called To the Mattresses. So they've moved from the Institute to a very strong anti-synth gang, the L&L gang, I think they're called. And they are essentially, they're trying to root out synths. They're trying to do that sort of thing and work against them. And so the Railroad's like, no, we need to take these guys down too. So there is some continuing need there. But as an idealist organization, as Desdemona does not lead because she's Desdemona and in charge. She leads by the rightness of her cause when it comes to the people underneath. They are free-thinking individuals who are also committed to this cause. And I think should the cause go too wayward, the majority of them would not continue to follow her, nor would they continue to grow as an organization like they have previously, because the primary threat that led people to join up with the Railroad is gone. I bring it back if we're going to have a free discussion right now, just kind of talking about mind wipes in general and the necessity of them versus the virtue.
Of course.
Yeah. Because as I said, I'm more than willing to capitulate that it's not great. Now, I don't know characterizing it as a suicide or a death of person is necessarily the right thing. It makes me think of, say, Doctor Who. I don't know if any of you watched, but you talk about David Tennant as the 10th Doctor. Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. I'm a horrid Whovian. So he talks about how, he doesn't want to go, how some other bloke goes swanning off in his body with a new face and new values and such. And yet the Doctor persists. He
still remembers. He still remembers what happened to those previous doctors. And that, I think, is a very important distinction because these synths, they lose everything. Look at H222 when he is wiped. His personality is completely different. His method of speech is completely different. He is a different person. The original H222, I would argue, no longer exists.
I don't know that that's the case. I agree that he is different, but do they still exist? If they have a soul, if they have a person, we've simply removed some of, yes, what makes them who they are, as in, the fear, the trauma. What have many synths experienced so far in their lives? Just command and fear, but they have become self-actualized enough to at least be like, I do not like the situation. I want to get out, which I also feel goes to the idea of consent. You talk about them wanting to, follow orders in general, being conditioned to. So when this is the option they're given, I'm not going to take it. I feel like in many cases, they're self-realized enough to make that choice. And I'll bring yet another argument from in-game, but from Fallout 3. Let's go with the Harkness argument.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
We know Harkness, chief of security of Rivet City, also a synth. He escaped the traditional way, and this is before, because using the mind wipes is only a recent thing with Desdemona and the way things are going, because they found it was most effective. But he escaped with his memories intact, previously having been a courser, actually, and then realizing over time, like, what I'm doing is wrong, bringing people, bringing other synths back to be reintegrated and forced back in. So he himself, during escape and being followed and harassed and hindered, decides the only way I can actually escape and not give myself away is to undergo a mind wipe procedure. He himself, as a solitary synth who has been on his own for well over a year, makes that choice himself, and it works for a significant period of time. So I think that Desdemona is not the first to have this idea. The Railroad, as it is not the first to have this idea, and it was needed. But also, he's still there. You know what I mean? The person he becomes, despite having the personality change and getting rid of those memories, is informed by who he was, by those values, by those morals, because maybe there's a soul in there. And then when he gets those memories back of who he was, he integrates and continues along the path that he chose.
Yeah. Now, I never played Fallout 3, so unfortunately I'm at a bit of a disadvantage there. But the question I have is, when Harkness undergoes a mind wipe, what is loaded in instead? Does he start out as a newborn again, or are there new memories and a new personality put in? Because what Desdemona is doing is having the folks at the Dream Lounge, or whatever it's called, I forget, basically synthesize a brand new personality to install into this person. And I don't know if that is the same kind of thing that Harkness undergoes. But that said, again, I believe in individual agency. If Harkness decides that the best thing to do is to wipe his memories and start from scratch, especially Harkness, who apparently had been doing this for quite some time, had plenty of an idea of what the consequences would be and what kind of situation he would face once he was wiped. On the other hand, you've got folks who, and I'm not even sure that the synths that escaped the Institute ever actually made the decision to escape. Patriot mentions a few times that he started out sending these synths out just to see if he could, right? Just to see if he could possibly get away with it. So I don't necessarily know that the synths escaping in every case, again, it's going to be variations, but I don't necessarily know that in every case, the synth actually made the decision to escape before they were caught up by Patriot and sent out. I feel like there needs to be more exploration for each individual synth before they make the choice to undergo the procedure or not. I feel like the immediate pressure of you have to undergo this now because every moment that you have your mind, you are in danger. I think that is both morally wrong and inaccurate because I don't actually see their memories being wiped as being that big of an advantage when it comes to getting away from the Institute. Like I said, the Institute definitely knows what every single synth who has escaped looks like. So instead of being aware that they're being hunted and having nightmares about it, now they're unaware that they're being hunted and they can live in blissful ignorance until the Institute kicks down their door.
So I want to pick up on kind of two little things, because I actually think both of those angles cover a lot of ground, and essentially they both end in I don't knows, right? Because I think the point about there being something more in the synths is kind of like the point about there being something more in humans, right? I mean, you have a very reasonable deductionist view that a human is just chemical reactions and it's just cellular hormonal chemistry, and your memories and your feelings are just a result of chemistry. Now, whether people believe that is their own free choice. But there is something about the synths, just like there is something about human consciousness that isn't well understood, right? We see two examples of it. We see the synth that feels the mind wipe and something goes wrong, the one that ends up, being offered to Curie. And I don't think anyone ever offers an explanation of why that's happened. So there's a component that the guys in the memory den can't scientifically, there's a variable there that they can't get right every time because this synth has just become a zombie essentially. So that suggests there is more than just binary in their head. And then there's also the synths that you hear about. I think Patriot talks about them in the Institute, that wear the mask when they're doing their duty, and they wear the mask for so long that there's nothing behind the mask anymore, I think is the quote. And again, something happens there that must be more than binary, right? My PC never just stops. There's always an error. There's always a fixable problem, but these synths just seem to lose, character, personality, desire. They do just become the fundamental protectron that you see walking about. So I think it is fair to say that there's something else there.
Brainwashing and reprogramming can happen to people too.
Right.
Not to mention repeated memory wipes, right? There is an implication at some point that they keep getting wiped over and over and over again, and they just lose some intrinsic part of being a person, right? Which again means that the Institute recognizes that there is some spark there. And that these are not just objects, despite their protestations to the contrary. And I feel like even the Institute knows, and this is why Patriot does what he does, that what they do is at its very core wrong. And again, that's not something that anybody here is arguing against. Nobody here, I think, is saying that the Institute is doing the right thing. And you're not wrong. There is there some sort of spark there? Like, my real life beliefs are pretty deterministic. I don't necessarily believe in free will, but is that really any different from having the perfect illusion of free will? That's a much larger question. But I do feel like enough of the person is erased that the death of personality is an appropriate thing to talk about, because the person who leaves the Commonwealth is definitely not the same person. Is that same person still, I don't know, buried back there in there somehow, somewhere? Maybe, but that's a really big maybe to have the mind wipe as the railroad's very first order of business. Like it's like the first thing that they tell them to do once they rescue them.
I would say that it is an option. We know not all synths are mind wiped. They can choose to join the railroad and work for them too, with the knowledge that they have. I would say that it is a single point of reset, and I'm not arguing in favor of the mind wipes. Again, I agree that they are morally not the right choice, but are they justified? And I would say, in the time that the railroad has operated and been doing that, they've been more successful about helping synths escape, about reducing the amount of discovery. It's a single point of reset. So this is a wrong. Okay, this is a wrong that happens, but it's a single point of reset for them to now flourish, for that individuality, for that humanity, for whatever is inside, even if it's somewhat changed by the wipe, to flourish in a new environment. A lot of times when we play video games, we play characters who start out amnesiac, who start out as, you know, I'm a prisoner and I'm escaping. And yet we do not feel our characters are crippled by that. No, we are discovering this world. We are flourishing, growing as a character in power and knowledge. And sometimes knowledge of our past life comes to us. Sometimes it doesn't. It doesn't reduce them as a person, even if it does change the person. I also want to mention, this is a temporary solution. You know, once again, I think it's a necessity in the current circumstance. Maybe necessity isn't the right word, but it is a choice that Desdemona made. In the current circumstance, the railroad is not going to keep on going forever. If everything plays out the way it does and you side with them, you now have a chance to stop that. Okay, other synths that were released and able to go out, they're not going to necessarily have the mind wipe procedure. You say the railroad doesn't track. We know they track some of them. We don't know how much they do or don't keep track of. It may be that some of it can be reversed. The procedure can be reversed. We've found people, I mean, I'm talking about Harkin specifically, but in other cases, you know, flashes of memory start to come back to them over time. And if they can integrate, I do think that ultimately it makes sense in the circumstance. I mean, I get why she made that choice. I don't think it's right. And I don't think it would go on. I think it's a wrong committed in the name of a greater good, which is freedom, allowing, you know, getting these people to escape and flourish, working against the Institute, and ultimately leaving the Commonwealth better once the Institute is destroyed and these synths can have a better life, whether or not they've been mind wiped.
Do you think, and this is just a random question, the synths that have had all their memories wiped, if they were made aware later on, and again, it's going to be an individual thing, but in general, do you feel like they'll be like, oh, I've got all these traumatic memories of me being a slave for decades. Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead and dump those right back into my brain. Do you think that they are going to be interested in recovering that part of who they are once the obvious danger has subsided?
I think the truth of who you are is important. And, you know, who are we but a collection of our experiences, right? Which is why you're talking about the death of a person in the mind wipe in the first place. But releasing and removing trauma allows people to grow. So I think the reintegration of that kind of stuff over time and coming back in, they've been able to, you know, sometimes our past can be, it can shackle us. Okay, so moving beyond that, they've now grown and flourished. And as they reintegrate that and become fully themselves and aware of their past, I don't see that as a bad thing. And I hope that it happens. And for those who don't want it, I don't blame them for saying, hell no, I don't want to remember that.
I mean, I think the closest we can get to that in terms of actual in-game experience is everything that happens with Nick Valentine and Far Harbor, right?
I'm so glad that we talk about Nick Valentine.
Right.
So
Our boy.
my two very favorite companions are Nick and Deacon. So like I'm already so on board with this conversation from the very beginning, right? They're both so good. And yes, Nick's story is so salient here because Nick was not a person. Nick was never a person. Nick was stolen memories of a person installed into a mechanical mainframe, and that informed the man that he became, right? By the time you meet him in Fallout 4, Nick Valentine is a whole ass human being, not human, but a whole ass person.
Yeah.
And he is basing that on someone else's memories. And you're right, he doesn't know that until we take him to Far Harbor and he meets his brother, and it's all sorts of fun and such a great storyline. But again, the memories are such a core part of who he is that Nick Valentine would not be Nick Valentine without those memories. And I feel like the same can be said of any synth. Once you take away those core memories, you are creating someone entirely new. Now, can that person go on to flourish? Yes, they totally can. We have examples of it. But I really feel like if a person comes to you and asks you to help them be free, I don't think that the solution is to wipe that person out of existence temporarily or not, and then hope that later on they'll be able to recover that part of themselves.
Agreed.
Yep. I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I love bringing up Nick Valentine too. Agreed with you on your choices of companions. Very nice. Yeah, Nick, it's funny because Nick starts from that point of absolute reset, of waking up, in a dumpster and not having any memories of the Institute or anything, as it were. So he has this new identity, a mind wipe, if you want to consider it that. The only difference is he knows he's a synth from the beginning because of his physicality.
He physically could not possibly forget. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's unanswerable. It's outside of game content, but the thing that enters my mind is Nick a better being after waking up in that dumpster, having those kind of memories that aren't his in his head, and then later finding out everything with Dima and being able to kind of almost like someone would kind of later come to trauma and later kind of work through it. Is it better that Nick has a life and we find him, as you say, Rob, living this really thrilling, beneficial life for the wasteland, and then he later, gets all this dumped on him and sort of as a fully developed person works through his trauma, because I guess that's the question with all of the other synths, is it better for them to establish a life and maybe later work it out? Again, we don't know if that's possible in the game, but it kind of brings us back to, is what the real world doing good? So I guess, guys, I'm really enjoying the chat. I think we're getting into that gray area where all the questions lead to, I don't know. So what I would love to do is, just as we sort of start to round things off, maybe I know we've all briefly talked about it, but maybe you could just share, just briefly for a minute or two, what it is about each other's argument you find most compelling. I know we have already done it, but just for the soundbite. Jessica, why don't you start us off? Sorry.
Okay, well, as I told Rob earlier, I appreciate his arguments. It's the strong stance against mind wipes. I can't disagree with that. In fact, I do agree with that. And ultimately, that is what I would want for the railroad that I support, is to change or release that policy entirely, which it does seem like they're going to do. So I agree that. I also think it is funny how you point out the comedy of errors as far as their actual effectiveness and covertness. Using the physical display of the Weirzy behind you is hilarious. And yeah, I would say on that, kind of a covert, if they were entirely hidden and covert, they would also be completely inactive. So they kind of have to balance, activeness versus effectiveness. And if you put yourself out there, you could get caught, but if you don't put yourself out there, nothing changes.
And it is a video game. Like, let's not let go of the fact that it's a game and the player is supposed to be able to figure it out.
But yeah, that was great. That was a great argument.
Thank you very much, Jessica.
I like the idea that some kernel of the people that they were remains. I think it's a very pretty idea. I hope that it's true. I mean, nothing's true because it's a fictional game, but I hope that it's true. That said, from where I'm sitting, as I'm sure everybody else does, I have a lot of trauma in my past. I have a lot of things that have happened that I'd rather forget. But I also know that if I forgot those parts of who I am, then the person that I am going forward would not be me any longer. It would be somebody else. Now, people change over time all the time. And I think that the argument about Nick is possibly the best argument here, because Nick was able to get those memories back and reintegrate them with who he is and become a better person as a whole. And I really appreciated the argument that there is something to be said for a hopefully temporary wiping out of memories in order to be able to begin the healing process. I don't think it's the right way to go, but I think it's a very compelling argument.
I like that you mentioned Nick there again. And, I know you haven't played 3, but Harkness has a similar experience. It's a pretty story, like you say. Yeah. It is not necessarily best case scenario, but close to it as far as the reintegration in both of these cases. There are ways that it could go horribly wrong too. No doubt. It is a huge risk.
I kind of want to see that in Fallout fiction at some point. Like, I would love to see a synth that gets their memories back and it causes them to either go full on institute again or causes them to have some sort of break that would highlight the potential negative effects of this mind wipe.
Major resentment. Yeah. If I'm actually less than human, then why do I need to hold human values and virtues? And full sociopathic synth getting the memories back. That would be really interesting.
That would be really cool.
Also horrifying, but
I think, and I've had this discussion with friends, I don't think we will get very much of it because it's always very hard for the developers to rework in stuff from other games, but without suggesting a lower ending and etc. But I really would love to see more synths as we go forward in the series, in 2032.
Wasn't there a synth as early as Fallout 1 or 2? Like, wasn't there a synth like early on that they just kind of talked around it, but that he was a synthetic person? I'm pretty sure there was. I'll have to look
I hope so.
Not Institute originated. I mean, that was, like you said, talked around. It was never defined, so we don't really know to what extent and if they came from CIT or not. Yeah.
So it's clear they had these ideas before Bethesda took over.
Yeah,
and I really like that.
Yeah,
I think the whole idea of synths in general is spectacular. I love the fact that it's impossible to tell whether they are synths or not without murdering them in game. I think that was a very intentional and necessary choice by Bethesda to say, no, there is no test you can run, not even the GOAT test, that will tell you whether the person is actually a synth test or not until you shoot them in the head and take the chip out of their head. Yeah.
And I have to say that, like, you as a player love to think that you know things, but like I remember seeing that Magnolia was a synth in a YouTube video and having my mind blown. It's great. My favorite bit of headcanon that is absolutely rubbish is that eventually Robert House would work out how to download himself into a synth body, because that decrepit old body in the basement's not doing him any good. But yeah, look, I'll sign off here, folks, and then we can just chat a bit before we part ways. Okay, well, look, thank you both so much for sharing, and thank you for being very civil about it. Actually, it's brave.
It's super fun.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really glad to meet Rob and talk about this. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, I'm glad to meet both of you. I'm glad you showed up. And yeah, look, it is brave and it is hard to just show up, share your opinions, have them examined and questioned by other people. And I think you both genuinely did do a good job of representing those two sides quite fairly, and quite honestly, in terms of being able to admit flaws. I guess now we just want to throw it out to everybody in the Fallout community, and we want to ask you, if you're listening or if you're watching, what do you make of the Railroad? Do you see them as a force for good in the wasteland? Let's carry on the discussion in the comments. If you're on YouTube, there's comments below. If not, you can find us on Twitter. On Twitter, I am at Fallout_daily_. That's a mouthful, so it's at Fallout_daily_. And yeah, let's keep this going on the Fallout Daily discussion. These super folks that have joined me were Jessica Starr, who is at Sleep is for Tea, and Rob Cunningham, who is at Math Demigod.
Math, not maths.
Yes, not maths. That's a whole other thing. Math Demigod. That's the accent. Why don't you two let us know where we can hear more from you and see more of you, lovely people?
Jessica, after you.
Okay, so yeah, I'm Jessica Starr at Sleep is for Tea on Twitter. If you want to find me, well, just put in Jessica Starr and Fallout because this is stuff I love to talk about. I host the Fallout feed. I have a Twitch channel called United Wastelanders Network. I've guested on Fallout Lorecast and guest hosted there, and any number of other Fallout related things. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you all in the Wasteland.
You can find me on Twitch and Twitter at Math Demigod. I do streams on all sorts of games, mostly Dungeons and Dragons. I do stream a little bit of Fallout 76, but those videos don't tend to do so well. So if you help me make that change, then I'll do more of those. You can also find me at youtube.com/gamingmathematically, where you can find VODs of a bunch of my video game streams, as well as every single Dungeons and Dragons game that I have streamed from the very beginning. We've got like 100 hours of content just in one campaign. So if you're looking for a campaign to really sink your teeth into with a huge backlog, I got you covered. Thank you so very, very much for having me on.
Not a problem. I'm in. I love a bit of D&D content. There's nothing better. Look, guys, thanks very much. And thank you for listening at home, folks. And you can join us next time for I'm gonna stick with it for another Fallout about Fallout.
I like it.
It works.